with the heartache. Coming down with the heartache.
On this episode of Between Two Beers, we talk to Dylan Cleaver. Dylan is arguably New Zealand's best working sports journalist and has won 34 journalism awards across 25 years as a sports writer and broken some of the biggest stories in New Zealand sport history. He's reported on the ground from 3 Olympic Games, 2 Commonwealth Games, 3 Rugby World Cups, 1 Cricket World Cup, was head of sport for 2 years at the Herald and is currently NZME's sports editor-at-large. In this episode, we discuss how he broke the story that Kiwi cricketers Chris Cairns, Lou Vincent and Daryl Tuffy were being investigated for match fixing, the state of sport journalism in New Zealand, his groundbreaking investigation into the links between concussion and dementia and what it means for the future of rugby, what life on tour with the ACC is really like, and much, much more. Dylan is a colleague and someone I look up to. He's played a big role in developing and improving my work as a journalist and editor, and is one of the most thoughtful, cleanest thinkers working in sport today. This was a thoroughly enjoyable chat which covered a lot of ground. I hope you enjoy it as much as we did. This episode was sponsored by Will Downey of Goodwill Law in Taranaki. Will is an old friend and a sharp guy who ditched his gig as a partner of a large regional law firm to start his own company, which improves the client experience through using better technology. 2 months after opening their doors, Goodwill Law has grown from 1 to 4 lawyers who service clients in person or remotely via teleconferencing. Goodwill Law looks after all your property, commercial and personal legal services, and their lower overheads translates to lower and more competitive fees. Goodwill Law, legal services made simple. You can listen to this episode on YouTube or your favourite podcast platform. Enjoy. Dylan Cleaver, welcome to Between Two Beers.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, I think.
We're in Dylan's Mairangi Bay house on the North Shore, beautiful spot, and he's on the Panhead Pilsners tonight, Seamus and I on the Boundary Road Brewery Pilsner Lagers. Different beers for different needs. Shay, how do you know Dylan Cleaver?
Well, we've actually met for the first time tonight. Had I known he lived here when I used to live across the way in Murray's Bay, we might have met down in Mairangi Bay for a beer. But,
maybe the Paper Moon, maybe?
Yeah, it would have been a Paper Moon, maybe a little Sunday morning brunch or something like that. But read a lot of his work, and obviously you two work together, and you've said nothing but good things about Dylan. So excited to have you on along the lines of the Chris Ratu episode that we did a little while ago. So I might go into my bag of questions and bring up some of those ones that I asked Rats before. But
I hope I meet his high standards for replies.
Well, so far the home that we're in is nicer than the studio we're in for that one. So far you're ahead in that regard. But Steve, you work together, and how long have you known Dylan?
Yeah, Dylan and I have worked together for 8 years. I'd say the first 4 we didn't work that closely together, but the last 4 we certainly have. He was my direct boss at one point when he was the head of sport, and now he's the sports editor-at-large, which is more of a sort of a roving writing position, but we work quite closely in my new role as premium editor. So yeah, enjoy Dylan's company. I sort of catch up with him once a week on Mondays, and we sort of break down the topical issues of the week and discuss column ideas, and yeah, it's nice. But excited to have him in our studio, well, in his studio tonight, because he's had a rich history, nearly 25 years of sports journalism, and he's risen to the very top of the field. So a lot of topics to cover, Dylan.
Let's go for it.
Right, well, I think the best place to start is 2013, when the ICC accused a trio of New Zealanders, Chris Cairns, Lou Vincent and Daryl Tuffy, of match fixing. The following year, Vincent admitted being involved and testified against Cairns, but no one was convicted. Then in 2015, Brendan McCullum, who was the Black Caps captain at the time, and Vincent gave evidence against Cairns during an 8-week trial in London for perjury, but once again, the verdict was not guilty. But Dylan was the one who blew this story wide open. This was something that totally dominated New Zealand media and international media for weeks, months, years. So take us right back to the start. December 5th, 2013, you are the head of sport at the Herald. So the head of sport role is more admin, less writing. I think you were editing the papers at the time and sort of doing rosters and things. But then, all of a sudden, talk us through, this tip comes through and you're about to set the cricket world on fire, international headlines. How did that start, and what was your reaction when you first got wind that you had something huge here?
Yeah, it was a curious one. Like, it started being an interesting couple of weeks that morphed into an interesting couple of months that kind of extended out to be an interesting year, really. And you're right, I was in a kind of more admin role and not enjoying it particularly either, I have to say. And I got a tip, I guess a little bit before that. As a cricket reporter, I'd been aware of some of the rumours and discussion around stuff that went on or allegedly went on in the Indian Cricket League, and it never really went very far. And it was as simple as this. I got a strong tip from a contact I trusted. It said I should make contact with another person, and it was made pretty clear to me that the tip was for me. I guess the general accepted practice in that is the editor would get a tip and feed it on to the relevant reporter. This person specifically wanted to deal with me, so I respected that. Ended up being a drive one weekend out into the country. Met at a place I hadn't been to before, and met two men there, and was handed a single A4 sheet of paper.
This is all very deep throat.
I'm captivated already.
With 4 lines on it, and it was very perfunctory. I can't remember exactly the lines, but it said 3 New Zealanders were being investigated for match fixing. None of them were current internationals. Match fixing investigators were in the country. And there was another line, and look, I stayed, asked questions, proposed names to see if they married up with ones I'd heard rumours about. I didn't get anywhere on that day, and I remember clearly that the only piece of further evidence I got was that it wasn't just the ICC that were chasing these guys, it was multi-jurisdictional, which kind of led me to believe that there might be some sort of police involvement, which turned out to be true. And then I sort of drove back home. It was a long drive, and the wheels were turning, not just on the car, they're turning in my mind as well. And I knew I just didn't have enough to go, and that.
So just to jump in there, so these guys were so worried about any sort of paper trail that they weren't prepared to email or talk on the phone, even the phone. It had to be a delivered A4 sheet of paper with a few lines on it.
Well, I guess when you're given a tip like that and you're told to be somewhere, you just do it, and you don't necessarily.
Are you scared at all?
No, I wasn't scared at that point.
Did you tell anyone where, I'm going out on a drive, I'll see you later on today?
Yeah, well, it was actually in quite a nice part of New Zealand, so I took the family and dropped them off somewhere. and then went, and I think that's how it went. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, and no, I wasn't scared at that point. I got a little bit worried later on in the whole process, much later on actually. But at that point, I was excited and nervous and immediately aware of the kind of responsibilities around legal, this sort of story, and I guess, I'm not betraying any confidences here by saying that this is not really grist for the mill for sports reporters. In fact, we're often our own worst enemy when it comes to getting a good, juicy news tip like this. The first reaction of a lot of sports reporters is to give it to the news desk. Yeah. I didn't have that luxury. One of the people, as I said before, made it clear that it was for me to chase, because they trusted me. So
normally, you're like I said, you're top of the chain at this point in the sport department. You're the head of sport.
Yeah.
So who are you confiding in this? Was Tim Murphy the
Yeah,
editor-in-chief
I
at the
rang
time?
Tim that day, actually, and I said, look, I may have rang Shane Curry too. I think Tim was probably editor-in-chief of the titles, and Shane Curry was probably editor.
Is editor-in-chief like the paper itself, not just the sport section?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
He was editor-in-chief of all the Herald titles, which would have been Herald on Sunday, Weekend Herald, and New Zealand Herald.co.nz, and the Daily Herald. And Shane was the editor of Daily Herald. I think that's how it worked. But Shane had been a long time confidant of mine, so I imagine I brought him on pretty early, and they were excited, but I think we all knew that there was still quite a bit of work before it. Was it a place where we could safely publish? So as it happened, the West Indies were in New Zealand at the time. It was a kind of a fraught time for New Zealand cricket. Brendan McCullum had taken over the captaincy from Ross Taylor in fairly controversial circumstances, and they hadn't got a win under their belt yet under the new regime. So him and Mike Hesson were feeling a bit of heat. The West Indies were in the country. Their first test was at Dunedin, and I just got on a plane and went down there because I knew I'd have to front New Zealand cricket. And it's far harder to shove someone aside if you're in their face rather than just on the phone. So I went down there, and as I got down there, that first night I was down there, an email I'd been waiting for a long time. This is probably getting close to 2 weeks after the initial tip. An email I've been waiting for a long time from an impeccable source in kind of a high up in the cricket world anyway, emailed me back and said, the story that you are proposing has merit and would not be contradicted at this end.
Wow.
So at this point, have you got names? Are you?
I haven't, but I'm really confident about two of them, and I wasn't confident about a third, but as it turned out, I should have been confident about the third as well. But
right, there's no secret who we're talking about here, right? Chris Cairns, Lou Vincent, and Daryl Tuffy. Are you able to say which ones?
Yeah, I'd heard rumours about Lou and Chris before, not so much Daryl, but it made sense because I think they were all playing for the same team in that ICL, which was, to be fair, a fairly Mickey Mouse sort of tournament as it turned out. But yeah, so once I had that email, I could go to David White at New Zealand Cricket and say, this is what I know, this is what I intend to publish.
When you get that email, that confirmation email coming through, is that lighting a fire? Obviously, you've been a sports journalist for sort of 15, 20 years at this point. Are you thinking when that comes through, holy shit, this is going to be huge, this is going to be the story of my career sort of thing?
Yeah, I don't know if I felt that. I know I rang Shane and Tim almost immediately and said, get ready, because I'm confident enough to publish tomorrow if the lawyers are confident enough as well. So I know I would have been, I'm sure I was nervous. I know there was a lot of cricket journalists who I hadn't seen for ages gathering in town that night, and sort of went out to meet them, and I had this thing inside me that I couldn't talk to anyone about, and I really wanted to. I didn't even know if my own cricket writer knew. I hadn't told him. I decided to keep the circle very, very tight. Just didn't want anyone else getting a hint that I was onto something. Not that I didn't trust the guy at all, but just the more people that know, the more things that can go wrong.
Loose lips.
Precisely. So, yeah, I went out with all this bubbling around. Legal came back. I don't think we ever really seriously contemplated running the names on that first day, because they would all have to be fronted. So the splash the next morning was big. It was all over the front page. I was doing radio morning.
Yeah, so 2013, it's not quite digital first at this point. At this time, it would be geared probably more towards an online release, maybe a big weekend Herald Splash. But at this time, was it all geared towards we're going to release it in the Saturday paper or the Herald on Sunday?
I think it was a Friday morning paper, and it was the whole page. And I definitely would have been thinking print splash. That would have been the way I was set up to, or geared to think then. The theory was that if you had a really big exclusive that you knew was going to be an exclusive, you saved it for the paper then. Now we'd just be going. And in fact, by the end of this series of articles on this box fixing, that kind of probably went for the best part of a year. By the end, we were doing scoops that were going digital first and having an impact that way. So that was right at that time where the Herald was kind of gearing into digital first, when we've been probably a little bit slow off the mark. Yeah, in those terms.
What's it like? So the morning where you push play and it's in the paper, are you sleepless the night before? Or are you excited about getting it out?
I don't think I slept very much, and I knew we must have had a formal tie-up then with News Talk ZB. Because it was arranged that I was going to go and do a slot on radio. So I knew I had to have my alarm set for early. I didn't need it. Like, I didn't put silent on the phone. I could hear it from about 5:30 a.m. just going ting to ting.
From memory, it was Player X was the first. Did we sell it as Player X?
No, then Player X came later actually. It was just 3 New Zealanders under the spotlight for match fixing. The front page photo was a disembodied hand with a cricket ball and a whole bunch of dollar notes coming out of his pocket. It sounds so ridiculous now. It sounds so cheap and nasty now I think about it, but I remember
it's old school clickbait though, isn't it?
Yeah, it was quite a striking image. I remember I was looking forward to the day at the cricket, watching the cricket, but I realised it was ruined. So I spent all the next morning. New Zealand Cricket put on a press conference at the ground at University Oval, which I only just made in time because I was doing all sorts of other things. So there were follow-up angles to be had. Like, people were commenting. I knew by now for certain that one of the names was Chris Cairns. So it had been confirmed to me. So I went to find Chris at the commentary box. Just missed him. He'd just gone to Dunedin Airport to get on a taxi to go back up to Auckland, where he fronted at Auckland Airport. There was a big crew of media waiting for him there.
So you're going to confront him. You didn't know he wasn't there. You're preparing to go and bring this to his face. Did you have a prior relationship with Chris? And what were you? Had you planned out what you were going to say? How you were going to approach it?
Yeah, look, I think at this point, that wasn't a huge concern for me because he knew that he was one of the players under investigation once the story had dropped. Well, I mean, he said that, it was the first he'd heard of it, but, there must have been something ticking in his mind that he knew he was one of them, else he wouldn't have left the ground. So I wasn't actually that scared about that. It's never comfortable. I had a minor relationship with him when he was a Herald on Sunday columnist for a while. So occasionally I would ghostwrite his column. This was a few years earlier. But I didn't have anything like a close relationship with him. I didn't really have close relationships with any players in any teams. So that wasn't something that bothered me. And I think, I prepared some notes, I'm sure, along the lines of, look, Chris, you're one of the names that I've been given. Do you have any comment? And it would have been as simple as that, really. Right. And but he wasn't there. He'd left. Luke Vincent, he ended up giving us a statement, or gave everyone a statement. And as it happened, the Daily Mail website named the 3 before the next day's paper could go to print.
So I wanted to ask you about the timeline of that. So the first hit was 3 players suspected, and then there was Player X, and then Daily Mail named Chris Cairns.
Player X is a long way further down the track.
Okay, so then Daily Mail names Chris Cairns, and then we name him.
Daily Mail names Cairns, Tuffy, Vincent, and they match up to the 3 that I know now as well. So I think the news editor at the time, or the investigations editor, was a guy named Chris Reed, who got in touch with me and said, "Are you confident the Daily Mail's got the names right?" And I said, "I'm absolutely confident, and I've just had it reconfirmed." So we went on the website straight away as well. And there was a little bit of nerves then because stuff didn't match it.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow. Come on, guys.
And that is actually one of those occasions where you wouldn't mind a little bit of safety in numbers. And
did they name different players?
No. They just didn't name anyone for ages. Maybe not even until the next day, once we'd put them in the newspaper as well. Or maybe it wasn't until Chris Cairns landed at Auckland Airport and fronted the media. I can't remember the exact timeline there, but I know that we were in New Zealand sense, we were hanging there in the wind for a little while.
You've broken the story. What does that mean to be? Are you the authority on every scoop, like international media coming to you, people wanting comment from you? What does it mean to have broken a story that big?
Well, it meant a lot in that it was. I'd say without a doubt it was the biggest story I'd broken. It meant a lot seeing it followed up by pretty much every media outlet in the cricket playing world. I don't know if I got a heck of a lot of international media asking me for anything. I think once it got out into the open, those like the English papers, they all had their own contacts at the ICC and places like that anyway, and that sort of community. So they would have sourced it themselves from then on. But because it was a New Zealand story, we had acute interest in it, and it just kept rolling along. There were several scoops that it got too much for me trying to do head of sport and cover every angle. So I got Andrew Alderson on board. Well, I shouldn't say that. It makes it sound very much like master servant, doesn't it? And it wasn't like that at all. Andrew was a really well-connected cricket reporter himself. He was keen as mustard to help. He had an in with Lou Vincent, which by that stage I'd lost. So that was handy. I can't remember the exact details, but I'm pretty sure that Cairns' representatives weren't that keen on dealing with me either.
What did that mean for your responsibilities as the head of sport? Over that 2 week when it was first breaking, did you put aside all those jobs, the admin and rosters and stuff, and just focus on the writing? Because you're building into that sort of Christmas period. It's a lot on your plate. Are you delegating that well, or is it all just a bit of a blur?
It was probably a bit of a blur, and to be honest, I was hopeless at that job anyway. So if the rosters weren't getting done on time, that was nothing new. I don't know if people picked up the slack there, or whether we realised that perhaps the role wasn't as important, as crucial. I actually can't remember that, but I distinctly remember thinking, this is what I want to do. I don't want to go back and start, assigning TV match reports to reporters and meeting the advertising team to see if there's anything saleable in sport for the next 6 months. So
gave you some clarity.
Yeah, that was the beginning of the end, I think, for my ill-fated foray into management. Yeah.
So it rolled on, like you said, it kept going and going and going. In 2015, Brendan McCullum and Lou Vincent, who had at that point admitted to it, gave evidence against Cairns during an 8-week trial in London for perjury.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so the McCullum thing is when Player X came in. So that was
Right,
another scoop that McCallum. It was discovered that McCallum had testified to the ICC anti-corruption unit that he had met with a player X on 2 occasions to discuss.
Right.
Where player X, according to Brendan's testimony, took him through the minutiae of spread betting and how it worked in cricket. And it was, I mean, I guess looking back, it seems obvious who Brendan was referring to, but at the same time, it was a little bit of a race to see who could
unmask player X.
Well, yeah, and in the end, it was really just which media publication had the balls to do it first. I don't think there was any mystery to who it was.
I remember Lee Hart coming out saying he was player X. You know, it was kind of like everyone was having a little joke about how obvious it was. But was there any thought it was an 8-week trial in London? I don't know if people knew it would go for that long. Was there any thought for you to go over there and cover it, seeing it was your baby?
Yeah, and in some ways I was disappointed I wasn't asked to. I'd probably be lying if I said it would have been nice to have been given the opportunity to turn it down, but in the end, circumstances made them do the right call, which was we had Jared Savage, who's a superb news reporter, a cracking investigative reporter, and a very knowledgeable court reporter. He was in the UK on a scholarship, so it was both sensible from a reporting skills viewpoint, and it was also sensible from a financial viewpoint. But yeah, I would have loved it if Tim or Shane had come to me and said, "Look, it's your baby. If you really want to see this through to the end, it's up to you." At which point, I probably would have gone back into my court reporting files, seen that it was an empty file, and thought, no, if Jared's over there and he's keen, he should do it.
Come on, guys, stupid idea.
Yeah.
All right, well, is there anything, looking back, that you would have done differently, or are you happy the way that you went about every aspect of that? I mean, it seems like you nailed it. You won pretty much every award going for that year and maybe the next year on your follow-ups.
Yeah, I think I handled the opening salvos of that really well. I was quite proud with the way I went about that. There were times, I don't know, regret's not a word for it, but it gave me a kind of insight into the geopolitical world of cricket administration, and some of the stuff I saw I didn't really like particularly, and also my view on why I was involved has shifted a little bit. And initially, maybe I was naive, and maybe this is what I wanted to believe, was that, you know, I'd established these great contacts when I was a cricket reporter, and I was seen as someone that could be trusted with sensitive information. When I looked back at it in hindsight, and I started writing up the kind of rap pieces that explain the whole process in there, I kind of realised that it was probably a lot simpler than that. And the simple fact was that Chris Cairns had taken a job at Sky TV in New Zealand cricket, and more particularly the ICC kind of knew in the background these rumours about Chris, and suddenly thought, oh, he's going to be travelling around the country with our current players. They were probably nervous about that, and needed to get that story out there, and I'm not disappointed I was the vehicle for it, but yeah, I can't claim it was any great Woodward and Bernstein kind of expose. But having said that, I think the work that Andrew and I did subsequently, and like there were a lot of legal potholes we could have tripped over on, and we didn't. I think there might have been a few warning letters from lawyers, but I don't think, well, I'm certain we were never we've never found wanting.
Well, hopefully we don't trip over any of those potholes in this podcast because the Between Two Beers legal fund.
No, and actually I think it's very important to mention here that Lou Vincent was went through the process with cricket and had received a number of life bans from the England Cricket Wales Board. Nothing happened with Darryl Tuffy. And Chris Cairns went to the High Court of London to face perjury charges and was acquitted. So
there we go. I think that's cleared us
of
any potential wrong
we
footing.
don't get Joe Edwards on the on speed dial.
Well, that's fascinating. That's a great start. I want to get into your journalism career. Like we said, you did a great piece about a month ago on 25 years as a sports journalist and the most intriguing characters. But I want to go back to the start and comparing old school with new school journalism and sort of compare and contrast what a day in the life of a sports journo looked like when you started with what it is now.
Yeah, okay, well it's a little bit tricky. Well, it's not tricky, I can explain it easily enough, but I wasn't typical in that I went to Tech and did my graduate diploma in journalism and went straight from there onto a Sunday newspaper, and to a sports department on a Sunday newspaper, which wouldn't be a typical career progression. And I was incredibly fortunate to do that, but it means that my day in the life is markedly different to most young journos, and that, our week was Tuesday to Saturday.
I was going to say, when you work for a Sunday paper, like, what is a week?
Yeah, Tuesday.
Just like chilling out, and then Sunday, here's my story.
Yeah. Well,
Friday, Saturday night, whatever it is.
In those days, the sports sections were huge, and the first Sunday paper I worked on, it was, I think, the sports reporting and racing team of probably 4, and we would have like 20 pages to fill, and so we worked really hard. But Tuesday you'd come in and you set out your ideas for the week. You do your featurey pieces kind of Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Then you looked for your news angles Friday, and Saturday was typically polishing off those news angles or live sport, depending on what was happening. So that was my introduction to proper journalism. And
just, you got a job straight out of graduate school.
Yeah.
Obviously that was because you were a talent that they saw. Did they peg you, in your later high school years or when you were studying? Did you get sort of tapped up as someone they were looking at? I
was really bloody lucky, actually, that during my diploma I think it was a 9-month course at AUT. It was AIT then. And I was placed on a 2-week internship in the sports department at the Sunday Star Times, and which back then was a bloody good paper.
Was it Trevor McEwen? Was he?
No, Trevor had just gone.
Right.
So he'd taken a job with Super League in Australia, and Duncan Johnson took over, and he was great to me. He gave me a bit of space. He gave me just the right amount of encouragement and just not quite enough rope with which to hang myself. So he was perfect for me then, and because I'd always envisaged myself going to Tech, then working on a community or a suburban newspaper, or if I was really lucky, a regional daily. And that prospect, thrilled me. I thought that'd be great, stepping stones. But I guess that 2 weeks with the Star Times probably gave me a slightly elevated sense of what I could do. And then Duncan passed on my details to a guy called Doug Golightly, who was then the one-man band in charge of Truth Sport.
Yep.
And Doug went on a holiday and got me in to do it. And I didn't find that as easy as the Sunday Star Times, because that was a kind of different style of journalism that I probably wasn't cut out for at that point. But again, I got some pretty good help there from a kindly old editor called Hedley Mortlock, who was allowed to smoke in his office. And he was the last of the great kind of, you roll your own cigarette fag hanging out the corner of the mouth, and all the smokers in the building used to congregate in his office, and the ceiling was yellow. It was kind of classic newsroom scene that you expected from the 70s, probably not the 90s. And as I was doing that, filling in at Truth, a guy called Innes Logan left the Sunday News to go and run a New Zealand Sport Monthly magazine. And that created an opening, which I applied for, and I didn't give myself a prayer of getting it. In fact, I talked to another sports journalist who I'd met over the course of my internship, and he said, look, by all means, have a crack, but you're not going to get it. There's so many experienced sports journalists that will go for that role. And it just happened to be a time when Sunday News was obviously looking to cut salary or wage. And I must have done enough at Sunday Star Times to convince them I wasn't lost cause. And I started there in 96 on, I think, somewhere around about 25,000K, and I was probably the happiest man in the world.
It was a different time then. You're probably too young to remember, Steve, but I used to go and buy both Sunday papers because of the sports section was so good to read.
Yeah.
And I used to try and get the truth, but only because of the nudie pics. But I do remember. I think it was Cricket World Cup in '96, maybe.
Yes. Yeah.
Like religiously buying that because they had such good level of journalism in there, and like reading match reports and analysis and stuff. And I think about what it's like now. It's completely changed.
Yeah, it is.
Maybe I was a nerd.
Yeah. I love how you're giving it. You're probably too young to remember. You're like 2 years older than me.
Yeah, but you wouldn't be interested in that sort of stuff. I'm very mature for my age.
The funny thing was, the Sunday News and the Sunday Star Times were both owned by INL, and they were both in the same building. We were Star Times was on the second floor. I think we were on the third floor, and we didn't have anything to do with each other. They were the enemy, and we were the kind of plucky underdogs. I think we were still selling close to 100,000 copies a week, I think, mainly because we'd just reduced the price to $1. So
that's why I could afford it.
Yeah. It was one coin, got in, got your paper. Sunday Star Times was the big behemoth. They had Duncan, who was just an excellent all-rounder, Mark Hinton, who was their kind of feature writer guy, colour guy, and Andrew Sanders, who used to break stories every week. And Andrew was a curious guy, but probably one of 4 guys I'd consider for the benchmark that I looked up to when I was young. He certainly would have been one of them.
Who were the other 3?
Yeah, okay. I worked with, my first sports editor was a guy, Campbell Mitchell, and he again was a curious guy. Campbell, he was my boss, and he gave me unbelievable latitude for writing and actually subject matter. But he always kept the plum rugby and cricket gigs for himself. and I kind of learned that you had to earn your trips. There was a hierarchy in place, and I wasn't there yet. He had a really good nose for a punchy angle, and another thing I had a sneaking admiration for was that most sports reporters try to be liked. He didn't give a shit that he wasn't liked by either the people he covered or the people he covered sport with. He was he used to get up a lot of people's noses, and I would probably join in with a little bit of backstabbing from time to time because he was going to all the cricket tests and I would have liked to go on a few myself, but I actually had a sneaking admiration for that. And yeah, as I said, Andrew Sanders at Sunday Star Times, he was just a tour de force. He broke rugby league stories, yachting stories every week, and I had to compete against him with rugby league. So Sunday morning, which is my first day off of the week, should have been a time of great relaxation, and it was always the most anxious time for me. And that huge anxiety to see what he had got and I'd missed. And there's one massive story that he should have scooped me on, but I ended up getting it too through. And have I got time to tell that story?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, long form podcast. Go for it.
Well, it probably helped establish me. Actually, it was. I was really fortunate that when I started at the Sunday News, the CEO of the Warriors was this big, charismatic Australian guy called Ian Robson. And he was a walking
marketing guy.
Yeah, he was a walking headline, and he also happened to hate Andrew Sanders, and it played into my hands because we knew things were coming to a crux between Robson and the Warriors board. They weren't happy with him. And the news was that they called this special general meeting for a Monday at the Auckland Leagues Club, I think it was. And the vibe was that he was going to lose his job there. So I spent the week kind of writing these preview pieces about what could happen at this board meeting and, how the numbers might be shifting or whatever. And kind of talked to John Money, who was coach, about Robson and if he did leave, what his legacy would be. And little did I know that was a ruse, and they were actually meeting in these legal offices in downtown Auckland on the Saturday, which is our production day, obviously. And so Robson gets out of this meeting where they've obviously worked out a severance package, and he's on his way. Who's the first person he sees when he gets out of the building is Andrew Sanders standing there with his notebook and a photographer behind him getting a really, if I remember rightly, and I might be doing him a disservice, a really poor picture, I think, of classic kind of paparazzi picture, but not a very good one. And I would have been scooped big time, but he doesn't give Sanders much. Obviously hops on his car. These are probably the days where cell phones are pretty big and pretty new. And I get a call into the office, and he said, Dylan, that prick thinks he's got a scoop about me, but how about you get round to my place in half an hour? So I got round there, and he talked me through what had happened. He couldn't be quoted on anything because he'd probably signed non-disclosure. And so he organised this photo that made it look like it was a pap shot, but it was totally staged. And I would love to know what Andrew was thinking the following morning when he picked up that paper, and we did a big front and back page splash. They had it they were a broadsheet, we were a tabloid, so they had it as a story on the front page, but it wasn't kind of elevated like the way we'd done it. And yeah, so I was bloody lucky there, and at the same time I felt it gave me a little bit of confidence that I could hold my own with Andrew, even though it had been gifted to me. I kind of felt, well, maybe that's how journalism works, you have these relationships and they work for you at times when you need it. But it would have, I think, I absolutely destroyed my confidence if I had woken to my preview of a board meeting happening on Monday and the best sports news reporter in the country had actually already reported what was going to happen at that meeting.
Did that light a little fire in you too about the excitement and the motivation to break these stories and get there first and get ahead of the competition?
Yeah, I think it did, definitely. And that environment, it was the other guy who I looked up to hugely was Wyn Gray. He's working at the Herald. There were two guys working at the Herald that I thought were pretty special, and that was Wyn Gray and Chris Ratu. And Wyn was he was a tour de force in the mid-90s for breaking rugby stories. But at the same time, reading Wyn's stories, it could make you feel a little bit like you're a victim of a minor assault. Like, he wasn't a big believer in colour, and he wasn't a big believer in light and shade. He just told you what was happening, and that, whereas Rats was a lot different reporter than he is now. He covered league, and he probably wasn't a massive story breaker in league. Like, I think Andrew Sanders and I probably broke more than our fair share of stories, but Rats beautifully covered league. He covered matches so nicely, and he also, you could tell that he really liked the characters in league, and that came through in his writing. And I thought I probably in the end took a little bit more from that than I did from Wyn's pure story breaking ability, although that was hugely impressive. But then the last guy, and the guy who probably had the most influence on me in my younger years was Richard Bock. When I first got to Sunday News, the guy covering cricket for the Herald was the doyen, DJ Cameron. But again, I don't think I'm betraying any journalistic code here when I say he was probably past his best by then. I don't think he was appreciated modernity in any form, whether that was the way journalism was changing or whether it was the way cricket was changing. And I thought that kind of came through, and his coverage was these really long match reports and previews that were flowery, and I mean, I just didn't think they were hitting the mark anymore like he used to. Like, he was a superb cricket writer for years and years and years, but I think everyone gets tired and everyone probably feels like they've seen the same thing over and over again, and it can read like that sometimes. So then Richard Bock came along from the Otago Daily Times. I think I probably had a cheek more than anything for DJ Cameron's role. I wouldn't have even got an interview. So I suddenly see this Richard Bock byline, and I'm probably a little bit bitter and twisted and thinking, this prick's got the job that I would have loved. And he was superb. I devoured every word he wrote. I admired his brazenness. He took on Richard Hadley. There's kind of great stories about him and Richard Hadley have been brought together to have this clear the air talk, and apparently down at Cornwall Park or something, the legend goes, and so they set up on this walk around the boundary, and they get back to the end, and everyone thinks, oh well, they survived the walk with each other, it must have gone all right. And apparently as soon as they got back to the starting point, they both went their separate ways immediately. So I thought that, I just thought Bock was great, and I love the way he put sentences together.
You talk about...
I just generally wished I wasn't, really. He was good.
You talk about these different writers, and they've all got sort of strengths, and I think perhaps your strength is that you're good at a lot of things. You know, some people are good at breaking stories, some people are good at writing opinions, some people are good at longer features. You seem to hit the mark in all of those categories.
That's very kind. And I think, it's very kind, and if there is truth to that, it's probably because of the Sunday schooling, if you like, and that I had to do it all. I was very, very late to the column writing game, and through design probably more than anything, and I'm still not convinced that's where my strengths lie. But as you know, opinion is such a massive part of our offering now that you can't avoid it, and particularly not if you're experienced like I am. You're expected to.
Well, that's almost all that's left, isn't it? You can digest sport every different way now.
Yeah.
So people's opinions are kind of.
Yeah. Well, let's climb into the current state of sports journalism. So at the start of 2018, you said in a Radio New Zealand piece, I think it was, to say I'm worried about the future of sports journalism is like Captain Smith saying he was worried about the Titanic after it struck the iceberg. So that was 2 years ago. Where are we at now? What is the current state of sports journalism?
Yeah, it's probably not my greatest line actually, Steve, but thanks for bringing that up. Yeah. Look, it's not great, is it? I think we've got to be honest here, but I think I've got to be also a little bit careful because I still have a full-time job, so I'm one of the fortunate ones, and because I'm a half step removed from what you call the classical daily sports journalism, I don't want to be that guy that spouts all the ills of modern sports journalists and journalism when I'm not out in the field fighting for those stories every day like those guys are. Yeah, look, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that we're in the kind of the midst of an era, or maybe we've just come through an era where sport has been really lowly valued in the newsroom of what you call mainstream news media, and like I mentioned before, as an industry we haven't always helped ourselves, and we might get to some of those reasons a bit later, but a lot of it's circumstantial, and the biggest circumstance is that sports journalism costs a lot to cover on the ground, and traditionally it has been terrible at bringing in revenue. But yeah, and the tipping point, I imagine, was when the New Zealand Olympic Committee and Sky TV shafted us ahead of Rio. We pulled out of sending our teams there, and our bosses discovered they could get as much traffic, possibly more traffic, from a team sitting watching it on TV at a fraction of the cost. And I think that has informed a lot of the decisions that have been made since. I don't know that for a fact. I'm not in the boardroom or in the executive when they're making those sort of calls, but I know that it was a fairly eye-opening for them just to realise how little they felt they lost by not having us on the ground. I think they lost a lot in other areas, but in terms of that raw data, those numbers, they thought, well, doesn't matter. Yeah. So look, without direct sponsorship, which raises a whole another set of issues around ethics and around, without fear of favour, I don't think we're going to see those big touring investments made again. I think we'll always have a couple at the Olympics, as long as those kind of rights issues don't come to the fore. I think we'll always have a couple at Rugby World Cups, but big teams, no. I mean, I went to 2006 Commonwealth Games, Melbourne, and I was part of a team of 12 from the Herald Publishing Division. I think right as we speak now, I should be in Tokyo.
Same, yeah.
where I would have been in a team of 3.5 publishing. I think that's right, isn't it, Steve?
Yep. I think 4 maybe. Yep, 4 at a push.
I think.
Shay, to bring it back to your point, what was it like when I started to what it is like now? Analytics has played a big part in the transformation of our jobs. So when we started, there was no, certainly not from our end, there was no reading of how many people were reading stories or what they were reading. Things went in the newspaper. There was no real understanding of what was being read and what was doing well and what wasn't. Where you look at now, and everything is being analysed. Every story is being judged on the page views it has, the length of time people spend on the article, and now we've introduced the paywall. How many subscribers are reading it, and how many people are signing up to read stories. So it's kind of like where everything is getting judged, whereas in the past it was kind of more of a gut feeling, I guess, right, Dylan? That was kind of the big difference, is you'd have an editor and he'd just have a feeling for what was a good story or what we should be doing without perhaps this analytical background.
And that's part of my problem. And look, Chartbeat does have some positives, not many, but some. And one of them is we don't cover stuff any longer out of habit. It's stuff that was palpably no market for, like
the Bowls Nationals in December, January that I used to work on.
Well, we should. There's an argument we should still be covering the nationals, but we shouldn't be doing previews for them and stuff like that. And look, we're not public service publishers, so we should be forced to do that stuff that no one was reading, that we could tell no one was reading. But in other respects, I think Chartbeat or analytics has been slightly ruinous in that, how do I put this delicately? And the obsession with analytics has taken away the one big thing the news media had going for us, and that we were the arbiters of the news, not the public. We had men and women with decades of experience on news desks telling us what was important, telling the reader the next day what was important, even if it wasn't popular. The important news is not always popular or controversial.
We've almost gone full circle though in the sport department specifically, because now we've introduced the paywall and the premium, and we're finding that going back to local community-based things is actually having a big pull on people willing to pay for it. And I mean, on the back of, I think you spoke in 2018 about when Stuff had just culled all their community journalists.
Regional journalists.
Yeah. So there's a huge gap in the market for quality writing done well at a local level, and we're seeing in our analytics that people are prepared to pay for this because there is this huge gap in the market. So is that where we're headed? We're going back to community-based writing?
Not necessarily. I think you have to pick your projects pretty well for that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, the whole paywall thing is interesting in itself, isn't it?
So everything you write is behind the paywall, premium paywall, and it's been like that for over a year now. So in the past, you might write a column or a feature or a big read that would get read by 40, 50,000 people online. And now behind the paywall, it's a fraction of that.
Yeah.
Was that difficult to stomach at the time and now, and how have your thoughts on that changed? And has your response from readers changed? Like, do you get as much feedback as you used to? Do you feel like you're dominating the news cycle
Can I ask
so much?
Do you feed that into the writers about how many people have clicked their stuff?
They each individually get analytics on how many people are reading stories, and
because I don't remember getting that when I wrote a piece behind.
it did very well actually. The top 10.
That wasn't me. I did not write that. I didn't.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a very short answer actually. Have I noticed a difference? Yeah, a lot less people read my stuff now than they used to.
Is that frustrating?
It was. I've had time to come to terms with it now, and look, I don't feel as bad about it now as I would about slaving over a feature for a couple of weeks and having no one pay for it.
Right.
So that's how my thinking is shifted on it.
I think we nailed down before we started that you'd won 34 journalism awards across about 25 years.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
How important is it being recognised like that? And do you write stories with the goal of winning awards?
The last part of that question is really interesting, actually. I don't now, and I didn't at the start of my career, but I think I did. I went through a period of not so much wanting recognition, but appreciating it all the same. So yeah, I'd be lying if I didn't acknowledge that there's sometimes a piece where you'll get halfway through and you'll think, hey, this story is actually pretty compelling, it's pretty riveting. If we dress it up quite nicely, it might be in with a bit of chance for some recognition, particularly in when you're doing feature pieces. News stuff is a little bit more difficult because you don't know what other people are working on. They might just have a blinder of a scoop and that will blow you out of the water. But kind of when you're working on features, occasionally you know that, yeah, this one seems to be pushing the right buttons. I'm interested in it when I'm writing it, so people are going to be interested in it when they're reading it, I hope. And
is that the key indicator for you? If you're really interested in the topic that you're writing about, you've got to feel that the audience will be as well.
And often I can even tell how interesting I'm finding a topic by volume of words, and like I get my head down. When I work on features, I normally work quite slowly, quite methodically, but occasionally there'll be days where you just write into it and you look up and you hit 3,000 words on the word count and you think, wow, that was... Then you go through them and you think, oh, that's rubbish, and you cut away like that. But those are the times where you think, yeah, there's something in this story. I think people are going to be really interested in this. You're not always right, but yeah, I mean, they're really funny things, awards. There's a couple of ones I picked up where I thought, oh, really? I won for that. And there's other times where I've probably unjustifiably, but thought that I was a bit of a racing certainty to pick it up and then have to remain seated as the as the winner's called up. So
well, I think I've been nominated for 4 journalism awards, and I think Dylan has won the category all 4 times. So it's kind of like playing in the era of the big 3 in tennis.
New Zealand football one, though, didn't you? That one that you...
Oh, Burge always beats me those ones. Yeah. That's Michael Burge. Either way, I'm getting beaten by someone. So.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I used to get a buzz when I won an award that would last for about a week. You go into the office, you have a bit of warm glow. And now it's a bit different actually, and I won a couple of awards for a series I did on concussion, a series I did on ex-rugby players who are suffering from dementia actually, so it wasn't really a concussion series as such, and it was cool to get acknowledged. And one of the awards, they actually flew one of the subjects of the story up to celebrate. But afterwards I just felt super flat about it, and it was worse than that actually, really. In a stupid way, I kind of almost felt I'd profited, although there was no money involved, but I kind of felt like I'd profited out of other people's misery. Mm-hmm. And I was getting this kudos for something where their lives were still as shit as they were when I wrote about them, and getting worse. And yeah, I have to confess I struggled with that for a long time, and I think maybe in some sort of karmic restoration, I don't think I've won anything since then. And yeah, I'm not a big believer in spirituality or anything like that, but maybe that's why.
But it's interesting because by shining the light on that, you've potentially helped other people kind of come to a conclusion as to why they might be as they are as well.
Yeah, I want to read a little bit and fill in a bit of background, because I think your concussion stuff is really important work, and it's kind of led the national dialogue a lot. So you've effectively been leading the charge in reporting on this since 2012, and I think your first series was called The Knock-On Effect, which explored a belief that rugby officials were laundering the risks of concussion to their players. But in a column last year, you actually called that reporting naive. Then in 2016, the series you're talking about was The Longest Goodbye, which sort of began as a human interest story about Neil Wolfe, a man in Taranaki, suffering from early onset Alzheimer's disease, and his family wondered whether numerous head injuries accumulated while playing for Wellington, Taranaki and the All Blacks had contributed. But that story quickly morphed, didn't it, into something much larger when it turned out a cluster of players from the same place and the same team were suffering from dementia. And I remember once the story started rolling in, it took some time before they stopped, as more and more families contacted you to talk about their tragedies. And you said in a column, it brought crashing home the idea that concussion, or more specifically, the long-term effects of concussion, wasn't just an abstract concept. This had the ability to destroy lives and to uproot the foundations of family. Now, the idea of concussion is fairly niche, isn't it? You've either got to have experienced it yourself or kind of know someone else who has, or have kids to really care about it. But I remember you capturing the national attention. It was like over that week and that month, I mean, you won a bunch of awards for it, but it really brought it into the mainstream. Can you just talk about when you went to the Naki and how that kind of evolved? Did it start as the one story and then it just blew up?
It did. And look, that 2012 series that you talked about, The Knock-On Effect, I co-authored that with Dana Johansson, and I don't think I've probably not fair there if I say the whole thing was naive, but there were certain things I wrote in that looking back I wouldn't have. Dana won a big award for that actually. So that it was a good look into concussion. The series, I think it was The Longest Goodbye, it was called, was something different entirely, and it started with a trip back to the Naki. I ran into a good mate of mine, Todd Wolfe, just one of those conversations you have when you haven't seen a good mate for a long time. How's it going? How's the family? And he said, Neil, who's his dad, ex-All Black, he's struggling actually. He's been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's, and so I just had this idea that it'd be nice to do a human interest story about this pillar of their family, and Neil was actually a bit of a pillar of New Plymouth society as well. What happens when the lights have faded, and the effect it has on family, and Todd, I got the feeling, probably wasn't that keen, and Todd's quite a private guy, and I understood that, but he said, look, have a chat with my brother Brooke, his younger brother, who I also knew really well. Brooke's far more into this whole, concussion, the effects of concussion thing. So I rang Brooke. It ended up being one of the most revelatory phone calls I've ever had. Brooke was saying, Dad, sometimes will ring because he's driven into town and he can't remember what he drove into town for. But he goes, it's not just Neil. There's, Ross Brown up the road, who was a great All Black. Ross Brown, he's my dad's favourite rugby player. He died with Alzheimer's recently, and his last few years were terrible. There's Bob O'Dowda, who I knew. Goes in, there's Bob O'Dowda across the park. He's got Alzheimer's now and he can't function at all. There's Kerry Hurley. I said, whoa, slow down, Brock. These guys they're all in the Ramfooty Shield team of 1964. And he mentioned a couple of others too who I never got sign off from the family to report on their illness. So this is bigger than a human interest story about one guy. This is a cluster of incidents in one team, and that seems like an awfully big coincidence. So I got in touch with can't remember the exact title, but a biostatistician, I think it might have been, from Auckland University, a guy called Thomas Lumley, who is an expert in his field, and I kind of put the numbers to him, and he came back and said, if it's a coincidence, it's this amount of coincidence, and it might have been 3 in 100,000 chances of that many people suffering from Alzheimer's in the one team. And my knowledge of the science wasn't deep enough for that particular feature to be a scientific based study, so it was still human interest. I just talked about how these families were affected, and you're right, you mentioned it perfectly before. It just snowballed. I ran that story on the Taranaki cluster, then discovered there was a cluster in the 1967 All Black team that toured Great Britain, including some great players, Waka Nathan being probably Prince among them, and I went and saw Walker and his family, and that was really moving. And it actually got quite difficult in the end because the inbox just kept filling up with sons, daughters, and grandsons and granddaughters wanting their loved ones kind of referenced as well. And
did you actually talk to many people who were potentially suffering from early onset dementia or Alzheimer's? As it happened, I was in discussion with an older All Black a few weeks ago, and we were talking about this concussion, and it was somewhat in denial. I sort of mentioned your series and the research gone into it, and it's probably quite difficult accepting that if that is something that is potentially in your future that happened when you were a lot younger to deal with. Did you actually experience that when talking to people who experienced it themselves?
Yeah, I found that a very common thread was all of them said they wouldn't change the thing. They loved rugby. Rugby was part of their fibre. They didn't like what was happening to them and were probably pretty worried about the future, but I think that the bond between them and the game was so strong that they couldn't comprehend their life without rugby. And some of the family members might have felt slightly different about it, but I don't think I talked to a single rugby player suffering from any dementia condition that said, if I'd known back then what I know now, I wouldn't have played.
What do you make of that?
I'm really not sure. I don't know if there's an element of denial there. I wouldn't really like to second guess their motivations, or whether maybe their minds are already too damaged for them to comprehend fully what's happening and what's in the future. It almost feels like and I don't want to be flippant about this, but it almost feels like a quintessentially Kiwi way of dealing with something. Actually,
in research for the pod, I read and watched some of the interviews as part of that piece, and I found the watching of it, particularly the loved ones talking about it, it's quite difficult.
Yeah.
And then I found myself thinking, and this is by no means any sort of comparison, but I had a run playing football where I got knocked out, I got kicked in the head, and I got knocked out, and then I played, I think, a week later, or had the week off, played the second week, and in the lead up to that, I got knocked out again in training.
Okay.
And I kind of just thought about my own kind of situation and thinking, shit, 20 years ago as it is now, I couldn't care less. Like, yeah, I got kicked in. It was almost like a badge of honour that you kind of you wore, and I would talk about it flippantly, like, yeah, I got kicked in the head, got knocked out, and then I went to training, and the ball came off the crossbar and hit me in the head, and I was knocked out at training, and laughing about it. And now I'm thinking, shit, if this is like a prolonged period of time, like, thankfully those are the only kind of concussion experiences that I've had, or whatever you want to call it. But yeah, like, it's quite scary stuff. Now, we've got friends who have played very high level rugby as well. Well, I just wonder about
So to bring that into the current, I'm just going to read a few parts from a column you wrote last year about it. You said nearly all the important markers for neurodevelopment or brain function occur between the ages of 8 to 13, including the organisation of sensory, motor and cognitive function networks. There is evidence to suggest that head trauma at this age interrupts this evolution. And then a study of 214 former American football players showed marked increases in cognitive dysfunction between those who played tackle football before the age of 12 and those who played after. The study was not well received. And Dr. Anne McKee, the neuropathologist who has identified CTE in the brains of hundreds of former sports stars, said the benefits of sports for children are profound, just as the development of motorised vehicles were for shrinking the world. But we don't put our kids in cars without seatbelts. Yeah. Which leads me, and I know you addressed this in the column, but good for the pod, you've got 2 young kids. Would you let them play rugby?
I would not let them play tackle rugby before 13. I actually wouldn't now. I've changed my thinking on that completely. I would fear for my son's life playing rugby at any age, actually, because I don't know if you've seen him walking through here, but he's skinny. He would be snapped in two. But no, in all seriousness, so that was to kind of give some context around that. Dana and I did the series specifically on concussion in 2012. I did the kind of human interest stuff on the old rugby guys with dementia in 2016. I think you mentioned it.
Yep.
And that was working on the assumption that concussion caused a lot of this. I won a grant off the back of that to go to Boston University to talk to the leaders in this field of CTE, which is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And kind of the discovery was that concussion, those big symptomatic concussion hits that you're talking about, Seamus, when you're knocked out, are not necessarily the principal concern. It's the repetition of subconcussive hits that are probably just as dangerous or more dangerous than having an isolated one-off concussion that you then recover from, and which is why, and I'm going off on a tangent here, so apologies to the person who has to edit this all together into a coherent podcast, but it's seen as a reason why we're seeing a lot more incidents of ex-football players getting dementia. Football is a game where there's a lot less of those massive symptomatic concussive hits that you see them wobbling around the field, but they're hitting the ball. So central defenders are hitting the ball 10, 15 times a game. God knows how many times in training. Back in the day, they used to do it with a wet leather ball. Yeah. They're not being knocked out, but there's motion going on. And Anne McKee was telling me that motion is more dangerous in kids. Okay, so it's not. I wouldn't be fearful of kids playing tackle rugby for those big symptomatic concussions, because really the collisions probably aren't that big at that age. Sometimes they are, like isolated head clash or an accident like that can happen, but really they're not talking about big powerful force. But there's still just a lot of that little in training sort of tackle bags, those tiny little subconcussive hits that are mounting up. And if they're more dangerous when you're under 13, which I know is arbitrary, why is something that's unsafe when you're 12 years old and 364 days suddenly safe one day later? But if it is more dangerous, I just don't see that the world is missing out on a lot by delaying tackle or contact sport till you're 13.
So I was listening to a podcast with Malcolm Gladwell, and he was suggesting that as research becomes clearer and more mainstream about the CTE issues of sort of American football in particular, that it will push the sport more into the ghetto, saying that it will be a sport that sort of middle to upper class families like yourself they'll see the research and they'll read all about it, and they won't want their kids partaking in such a dangerous discipline, whereas the kids in the lower decile areas will still see it as an escape. If their kids show some sort of athletic prowess, it might be their ticket out. They'll still encourage it because they're seeing, like, fuck it, we don't have much else going on, sort of thing.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that, and how do you see this in the future was specific to rugby?
I do see it, and I think we might be already seeing it, although the reasons for that might not be so much. There might be other reasons for it as well, and you got to be really careful how you frame this, because you're getting into kind of sociological and demographic debate here. But there's no doubt we've seen white flight in rugby. I mean, stupid is the wrong word for it. You're incredibly naive if you think that the numbers. Auckland Senior Club Rugby now, right, is Pacifica majority sport. I'm pretty certain that the Pacifica population of Auckland is around about 14% of the general population. We're not taking Maori out of that equation, right? So this is just Pacifica, which is mostly Samoa and Tonga. So Auckland Senior Club Rugby is more than 50% Pacifica from a 14% population base. There are clubs that used to be almost exclusively white in Auckland, just through historic. I'm not implying in any way any sort of segregation here or any of those tired old racial tropes, but the clubs like Grammar, Old Boys, which is merged with other clubs now, University, another couple of clubs tended to be white majority. College Rifles, white majority. Now they're you struggle to see a white face in those teams on some Saturdays. So it's very real. Now,
I think the NRL as well, isn't it? It's disproportionately Pacific Island as well in terms of their contracted players.
Yeah. So it's happening. Now, those the where do you trace it back to? The kids or the parents? I imagine it's the parents. You ask them why. The white parents, why the Johnnies and Janes aren't playing rugby as much as they used to, and there's probably not a single reason. Like, I doubt they're going to come out and say, "Oh, we're really scared of them getting knocked out by bigger kids." And scientifically, I think Pacific kids do mature earlier, and so they're more likely to say, "Oh well, there's just so many options these days. There's mountain biking, there's all this pay for play sport options, and there's also the very real fact that as Asian population in Auckland has also risen dramatically, and historically they've got no ties to rugby, so they're not playing. So there are kind of demographic reasons for it happening, but let's go back to your point. That was a very long-winded, extremely rambling answer. Is to say Gladwell is absolutely correct.
So you went and spent a few days with one of the world leaders on this.
Yeah.
Is it your understanding that this research is going to keep coming, it's going to keep getting more in our face? You know, it's kind of like we're sort of somewhat aware of it at the moment, but maybe in a year, 2 years, 5 years, it's going to be so overwhelming that we can't ignore it?
I think the research will continue along a roller coastery type path. You see quite extreme stances taken that basically all contact sport is inherently dangerous and should be banned. Coming back to, and the other extreme is, you need to get knocked around to harden you up. And we'll find a place in the middle where they'll probably come to some sort of consensus about what is the right amount of hits to be exposed to, I guess, and so that the science will go where the science goes. It's our attitude to it that will change. There's a bit of a stigma being removed around that whole dementia issue, whereas I think even 10, 15 years ago, if a family, like, no one wanted to talk about the fact that Mike Webster, who was a Pittsburgh Steelers legend, had gone absolute troppo and was living in his Ford pickup truck, and he had to taser himself in the head to get some sleep and glued his teeth in that. No one wanted to make that connection between his madness and the sport he played. Some of that stigma's been removed, probably not through anything the sports administrators have done themselves, but just by sheer weight of evidence. I imagine that will continue. There's a lot of quite amazing work being done in the UK by advocates. Jeff Astle, who was one of the first footballers to where his struggles went public, and the coroner actually ruled he died of industrial disease, which meant that it was his profession that killed him. So ever since that, there's been a lot more recognition that there are dangers.
Did you watch the Aaron Hernandez documentary?
Yeah. I mean, that was just, I was about to say it was insane. It literally was insane, but it was frightening, wasn't it? He was. So I'm not sure if it was Anne McKee who sliced up his brain and took the samples, but whoever...
Is that who you went to visit?
Yeah, I went to visit, and Dr. McKee in Boston, she was one of the people I visited. She's an amazing woman, actually, gutsy, taking on the NFL, which is a industrial complex of the size we can't fathom in New Zealand. But whoever it was that did the samples of his brain said it was just riddled. It was... it was a decaying sponge cake. It was. There is too much evidence now to say it's random. We know.
So in that regard, I feel like you should be quite happy with your work in terms of casting.
Yeah, but it doesn't actually really make me. It's a funny one. I don't know why. I can't put my finger on why I don't feel happy about it, but I think it is the fact that I recognise that every story I do has a story of misery behind it.
Well, it's a heavy topic.
And there was a time where it just didn't seem to stop, and everyone who contacts you with their loved one's story is the most important story in the world to them, and you've got to be realistic, and it can't be the most important story to you, because some people...
It's interesting how that came out in your writing or your time. I remember when you came back from Boston, and it might have been about 6 months. I don't know if this was you were delaying it because we were releasing the paywall at the time, but it seemed to take an eternity for you to write that piece. And like you say, when you're really into something, words will flow and you'll be excited to get it out. But that one seemed to, you sort of held it back for whatever reason.
Yeah, and it sounds really callous when you put it as bluntly as this, but a part of me was probably actually over it and thought, is this just going to start it up again? And I also got really pissed off when I did the initial Longest Goodbye series on the dementia. I got really pissed off with the level of some of the debate, and I shouldn't, because you put a story out there and it generates talk, and that talk will just go where it goes, and you're going to get people that will have extreme views on it. But I felt too attached to it, and I'd hear people say really dumb stuff, or I'd see them quoted as saying really dumb stuff, and I'd get actually quite angry, which I never really do. As I said, you do a story, it's out there. If people are talking about it, that's great. But I actually cared about what people were saying, and when I was hearing dumb stuff, it would eat away at me. And
when you know so much about a subject, and you've gone and you've spent time with the world-leading researcher, and you hear people spouting ignorant views on something you know so well about, of course that's going to be frustrating.
Yeah, and I just felt like that was one of the premium paywall was probably one of the reasons. I think. I'm pretty sure that whoever was leading that project at the time wanted to keep it back. But yeah, it was a little difficult. I knew the kind of stuff that was going to, the debate it was going to attract, particularly, I think I launched straight into that. I finally kind of got the motivation to do it, and I decided to start in a very unconventional way for me, which was essentially an opinion piece around why I don't think kids should be playing contact sport.
Which is essentially what it boils down to, right? That's the most important question. Should I let my kids do this or not?
Would you let your boys play rugby, Steve?
They're a few years off it, so I don't know.
I don't think not much going to change between now and then.
That's a tough question.
I've no problem with touch and ripper, which I think are great additions to the rugby stable.
Let them play football.
Even with the heading.
I'll let them head the ball. Yeah.
See, I don't even know about that, actually. I don't know how much we'd lose as a nation if we made football a ground-only game till...
Well, Stephen would be out for a start. That's one of his strengths, is heading.
Flick-ons from throw-ins.
One of the only people in our team that can do it.
You can kick it in the air, but you got to control it with your lower body.
He's out.
Well, let's move on to a topic which is a little bit more light-hearted.
Thanks.
So one of the features I quite enjoyed over the last few years was when you went on tour with the Alternative Cricket Collective. And I've seen you on a few of their live streams with cricket games and black caps and ODIs and things. And Shay and I often talk about those guys. It seems like they have the best jobs in the world. It's just a bunch of mates that have an excuse to get together and have beers and talk shit and live the dream. So you went for, was it for a week?
Oh, it ended up being... it stretched out to be a month, but I was only dipping in and out of their tour. Like, I didn't stay the entire month on that tour. I would have been dead if I did.
And is it what it looks like from the outside? A bunch of sort of semi-functioning alcoholics who are able to just sink piss and do their jobs well?
Kind of. They're actually really smart guys. They do have blowouts, obviously. They do love their sport and they do love talking shit, but there's actually a lot more method behind the madness. They're actually getting quite old now too, which I often tease them about. I mean, you're still going to be joking about your penis when you're like 45. When does it just start to get a bit sad? But
is there structure to the way they do things? Every day is mapped out?
Yeah, they plan pretty well. In fact, sometimes one of the things I noticed on that trip was I was actually envious how well they planned and how well they had back-end planning in the office as well to make their lives easier.
Who's driving that? Is that Mike Lane?
Yeah, Mike Lane and Jeremy own it, and then they sold it to NZME. So I think that's how it works. They might still own a chunk of it. You'd have to ask Mike about that, but
it just appeals to me so much as you pass it off to the family as I'm going to work, and work for them is watching what they'd be watching anyway, having beers with their best friends.
It's your dream, isn't it?
Do you know, it's bloody hard. I am useless at it. I'm so bad at it, and I think it's because my mind is conditioned to watch sport slightly differently, and I can't see all that stuff that you guys that are fans and that would see. And I miss everything. A slow period of play for me, watching sport is torture. For them, it's just the greatest opportunity to talk smart about lighting farts, about music. Yeah, there is. It looks super easy. And I remember the first time I actually sat down with them with a microphone, and I couldn't contribute. I was hopeless.
Yeah. Super knowledgeable guys too. I think when you were head of sport, you had Jeremy Wells doing a column, and it was a great column. It was such a good read every week. He put so much thought, and he had such an incredible base of knowledge behind what he was doing. So it's got these guys who seem like they're just having a laugh and having a beer, but they're actually so clued up.
Yeah, I mean, Mike was a very serious cricketer. Jeremy was a good cricketer. Matt Heath is a sport tragic. He knows so much about it. Jason Hoyt was he was nearly a first class umpire, I think.
Was he really?
Yeah.
A great umpire.
So they know their corn. They are very clever guys, and they deserve all the success they get with that.
It's so good. I found myself down a Matt Heath rabbit hole. I was sick over the weekend, and I ended up watching old episodes of Back of the Wine. It was so good.
Yeah.
He was in a band that
Deja Voodoo.
Hilarious. Singing songs about Timaru and six packs.
Yeah. Today, tomorrow, Timaru.
We've touched on some of their cricketing pasts. What about yours? Now, you played Premier Cricket up to a certain level. How far did you go?
I did play to a certain level, I think everyone plays to a certain level.
What level was it? And how close did you go to actually making a career?
Being a black
No, not close at all. I would describe myself as a slightly above average schoolboy and club cricketer, and a slightly below average representative cricketer. So I played a few seasons for Taranaki, which is a minor association, and I played all the Central Districts, or most of the Central Districts age group stuff, without ever cracking to the Central Districts first class team. But
what are we talking here? You're batsman?
Top order batsman and part-time spinner, which was... I basically stopped playing seriously when I was about 23, and there's no false modesty here. I was wildly inconsistent. Like, I was a guy that would string together scores like, say, 50, 0, 3, 5, 70, 9, 5, 3, and occasionally get 100 to make myself feel good.
So like most New Zealand top order batsmen.
I was just a very, very poor starter. And, I loved cricket. Absolutely loved it. I still adore cricket, but I think I like the idea of cricket more than I ended up liking playing it. I was never a guy that had a really hot streak, but I would have frequent poor streaks. So there's never a future in it for someone like that.
In those CD age group teams, what sort of characters are you knocking around with?
Well,
of note.
Actually, we were really successful. We won the National Under-20 tournament, and with a team that I don't think anyone in our team went on to play for New Zealand. And we won that tournament by a mile, and we beat a Canterbury team that had Astle, Fleming, Jeff Allett, Gary Stead, current New Zealand coach. Wow. The Northern Districts team had Mark Bailey and Dion Nash, who played for New Zealand. Matthew Hart, probably. The Auckland team had Matt Horn, a whole bunch of guys that end up going on, but we were
really interested in some seedy names that you could throw up, because I'm a bit of a cricket tragic.
Campbell Furlong,
Good.
I think, probably played. He was a kid. He was like 16, but he was our off spinner, and he had these fingers, and I'm pointing it out, which is no good on a podcast, I know. But just take my word for it, he had these incredibly long index and middle fingers that he used to just wrap around the ball. He got a lot of wickets for us at that tournament. His older brother was a guy called Johnny Furlong. They're both sons of Blair Furlong, the All Black, or Maori All Black, Hawke's Bay rugby legend. Johnny Furlong was rapid. Shit, he was fast bowler. Second fastest bowler I've ever seen in the flesh. And the other guy was a guy we played at that tournament, which was Heath Davis.
Heath Tiahu Davis.
Heath was, oh man, when he got it right, Heath was just truly terrifying. He was that's my fun. I'm going to have a little brag moment here. That's my finest moment.
It's your episode. Go on.
At that National Under-20 tournament, we played Wellington in a 3-dayer in our opening match. And I think we're chasing something like 300 to win in the fourth innings, which is not normally done. And I got 100, and they had Heath and a guy, Chris Lee, who was a fine bowler, and maybe a guy, John Morrison's nephew, might have been in their bowling attack too. And that was probably my peak cricket moment. And I know I got a first ball duck in the next game against Canterbury. Nathan Astor, LBW, and I don't think I ever recovered.
Did any of those guys in later life, when they were playing and you were working as a journo, did they recognise you from those tournaments?
Yeah, I'm sure. So it's one of those weird things where you hope you're kind of recognised when you start covering cricket because it would give you a little bit of credibility.
Yeah.
So they know you weren't just being a dicks and when you wrote them off.
Steve tried that. I remember.
But at the same time, you can never be a knob enough to go up and say, "Hey, remember that tournament?"
Yeah, Steve tried that as well.
So, I think Bill Tuiloma, I played with him for a season at Waitak, kind of very vaguely, and there was like an all whites game where he was like, Bill, tried to give him the eyes, and he just totally blanked me. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
But do you think that having a cricket background like that, playing to that level, was important in becoming the cricket journalist that you were? Do you think you could have risen to where you were as a journalist without that background? Did you need to know the game at that level?
Cricket's quite a complex game actually, so I do think it does help a little bit if you're going to be covering games and doing analysis type pieces. It doesn't help at all if you're just in it for news breaking and establishing contacts and trying to break stories. But if you're going to be on the ground covering tests, I think it helps. And you look, Richard Bock, his brother played for New Zealand, and he played to quite a high level. He was a rep cricketer. Jonathan Milmo played for New Zealand. He was a very fine cricket reporter for the Dominion Post. Mark Ginty was a good player. I think he was a good club player, but he was a very good club player. So David Leggett. He played senior club cricket in Canterbury, and his dad was black cap before they were called black caps. So yeah, I think it helps.
There's a saying that the best stories are the ones. You're right. We'll just have a little pause. Okay.
That's Liam, by the way.
Liam. There's a saying that the best stories are often the ones you can't publish. Can you vaguely hint, or can you talk about some of the ones that came close that you never quite got over the line?
You know, I didn't have a lot. I'm sure I didn't have a lot, but I know that I was about to break the story that the player power had was about to push the Black Caps coach Andy Moles out of the job, and Jonathan Milmo beat me to that by a day. And the thing that really pissed me off about that was I was ready to go the previous week, and I just didn't quite have enough. I really needed one more person to corroborate it, and I put in about 4. It was a Sunday situation too, so I put in about 4 calls on that Saturday, and no one had got back to me. And I just thought, no, I can't go with that. It's not fair. I put the paper in peril if we get it horribly wrong, and that. And it lasted all the next week. And I got through, and then on I think it was a Friday morning, I got a call from Andrew Alderson, who was at radio at that time, and he goes, "Oh, Horsey Milmo, eh?" What a brave piece. And I'm like, "Oh, you anchor."
Having been on the end of some of those missed calls from journalists, is that not enough to tell you that what your gut...
No, it's not. I mean, yeah. I mean, you could say that, but then you get it wrong, and someone will say, "Well, did you get it corroborated?" And you say, "Oh, well, I put a few calls in, but no one got back to me." Yeah, you've got nowhere to go. So
yeah, I always thought, like, if I'm blanking, when I was doing media for New Zealand football, if I'm blanking a journalist call, they know that I know that I know that they know.
Yeah, right.
That it's right.
Especially if you're always picking up, right?
Yeah, and then you just like.
At that point, I kind of.
It's a hard one, like being the other person at the other end of that conversation. If you're working for an organisation and a journo rings you with what you know is right, but you're having to toe the party line and say, "Well, actually..."
No, I probably wasn't that detailed in my messages either, because it was a real exclusive situation at that point. So I just wanted them to call me back. I would have been saying stuff like,
off the record.
Yeah, hey, look, I've just got I just need a steer from you. I've got a story. I probably didn't. Yeah, well, I'm looking back now, but I probably didn't give enough details in the message. So, I mean, I've had a few athletes who have had issues in their lives that I've been close to getting them to share with me.
Were you close to breaking the Nick Willis masturbation?
No, I wasn't.
Sorry, I thought that was what you were talking about.
There was a hell of a young... It wasn't masturbation.
It wasn't masturbation at all.
You're joining the dots there.
Yeah. Some people just watch it for fun.
I don't know where that's come from.
Yeah. I did break one on a similar line, actually, that I was always strangely proud of, and that was... one of the New Zealand cricket coaches, a guy called Ashley Ross, who was in charge of their biomechanics department or something, had written a paper which he distributed to the professional players in New Zealand, talking about the different forms of practice and how having throwdowns was like masturbation. Having a net was like phone sex, and how open wicket practice was the real thing. And so someone this just won't do, and gave me a copy of it, and that was I was always quite pleased to have broken that. I think the headline in the Sunday Star Times was something like, "New Zealand cricket is encouraged to master the pull shot," or something terrible like that. Like, it gave me a chuckle.
Let's talk sports leadership in this country, because I think you might have written more or with more authority on this with perhaps anyone. Does Sport New Zealand and High Performance Sport New Zealand have its funding model right? If you were to scrap everything and start again, what would your funding strategy be?
Yeah, it's a really complex topic, this, and my short answer would be no, I don't think they've got it right now. I think they probably had it right. I think people's expectations kind of shift and trends shift in the sports administration and high performance sport delivery mechanisms around it change, and I'm making huge generalizations here because it's a really complex topic to drill down to, but I think after the Sydney Olympics we recognised that things had to change. Like that was the closest New Zealand will get to a home Olympics we sent a big team over there, and with 2 days to go, we haven't won a gold medal. I think might have won a couple of bronzes, and Rob Waddell ended up winning a gold on the second to last penultimate day or something like that. And I think there was a bit of an embarrassment for New Zealand, because we're being mocked quite often in the Australian what's the show, HG and Wales, can you remember them? Roy and HG, who did a great little satire show of the Olympics, and New Zealand's medal tally was coming up every night, and it wasn't pretty. And I think there was a realisation that actually, no, the Olympics does mean a little bit to us. We do want to win medals. It's aspirational. There's probably a feeling that kids were drifting out of sports like athletics and swimming and that at the time, and one of the reasons was that we're just no good at it anymore. You know, the days of the black singlet being fed on the Olympic track were long gone. So they probably decided they needed a central pool of money and a far greater centralised control on how that money was used, and it was the right thing to do for that time. Now, I think Sport New Zealand and High Performance Sport New Zealand, High Performance Sport New Zealand is a subsidiary of Sport New Zealand, but they run as two separate entities. My personal opinion is they're bloated now, and they've lost a bit of direction, and lost in some ways they offer too much. I think power should be given back to the sports, and there's a counter argument here that's a very compelling counter argument, is that some of these sports are just not capable of delivering high performance programs. But I think that's what Sport New Zealand and High Performance Sports New Zealand's job should be, is to increase these sports capabilities, get expertise in these sports that know specifically what they need for those sports. Sure, there's going to be some cross pollination. There needs to be in a country like New Zealand size, but they've spent too much money goes into bricks and mortar and into staff at AUT Millennium that could be much better spent going directly to athlete and coach. Is that
yeah, I think that's a good answer.
Enough?
Jay, happy with that? It's pretty accurate from my kind of observations of, from a football perspective, dealing with high performance sport and going into those offices. Yeah, I think that's quite spot on.
Yep, we'll take it. What gets you excited? Start again. What gets you excited these days about sport? How much do you watch? Can you imagine doing work in a non-sport field?
Yeah, I can actually. I just don't know what. I often think about what I'd do if I wasn't in sports journalism. Look, I watch nowhere near as much sport as I used to. I don't know if that's good to admit or not. I still love cricket, but tend to dip in and out of watching it. I love good rugby and have zero patience for ordinary rugby. But I have to say that Super Rugby Aotearoa has kind of reinvigorated something in me in terms of rugby. But at the same time, it means I just can't bear the thought of going back to watching the Highlanders versus the Rebels of a Friday night or something like that. So it's a double-edged sword, that. I've lost my passion for the NRL. I don't know where it went, but it went somewhere. I find it a bit overcoached and a bit formulaic, and I think the athletes are amazing. That's not a knock on them. I just actually think the structure of the game has become too predictable.
Where do you stand on State of Origin then?
Yeah, I used to be absolutely avid. Like, I wouldn't miss a State of Origin.
I can't remember the last time I watched one.
I forgot it was on last year. I literally went into work the next day and saw on someone's screen highlights of that. Oh shit, that was on. Yeah, and that would never have happened. So I'd enjoy netball a lot more with a couple of subtle rule changes.
like backboards and...
No. I love netball. I think netball is a wonderful game, and it's so dynamic until you get to the act of scoring, which is theoretically should be the most exciting part of any sport. But in netball is where everything stops.
Yeah.
And I think they need to refine some rules in that circle to make it a more fluid game.
You never watched netball, do you?
Yeah.
Not really, not my favourite sport, but
That's all right.
I find the business of American sport really diverting, but the actual practice of sitting down, and I love all the stories around American sport, and they cover sport amazingly in America. But I struggle to sit through entire games of NFL or Major League Baseball, even basketball. A good favourite colleague of ours, David Leggett, used to have a saying about basketball that they should just fast forward it to the final 5 minutes.
My dad says exactly the same thing, but it's 30 seconds. We just need to tune in for the last 30 seconds every time there's a basketball game on.
And well, I think that's, it might be a product of that generation. I do think that there's sometimes they're right. I've rediscovered my love for Liverpool, and that love is probably more Jurgen Klopp and Sadio Mane than the entire business of the English Premier League. But
Side story here, I got to take over Dylan's Facebook page for a day. It's about 2 years ago where he bet that Liverpool would finish higher in the league than Chelsea.
Yep.
He was totally wrong, as per. So I got to post a video on his Facebook page, just take over it, do whatever I want, and sort of said, Dylan's let himself down again, total embarrassment. And I think it was the highest engaging post on your Facebook profile.
Yeah, I'm not a big Facebooker now, so it's probably still sitting there quite high. And V8 Supercars actually is my guilty pleasure.
Okay.
I just love the coverage of it. They do such an amazing job with it.
So that's sport. What about media? What do you read? What sites do you visit? And who are your favourite current writers that you like to read?
You're going to ask him the question you asked me and Gavin. That was a bloody good one, actually.
What's that?
The top three. Who do you listen to?
Well, yeah, we can add that one in.
Okay.
The top three most influential thinkers in your life.
Okay.
It's a bloody good question. I still haven't come up with an answer.
Do you know what? I don't consume as much media as you'd probably think, and I don't post on Twitter, but I'll occasionally scroll through Twitter if I need to find something. I'm not really on Facebook. Well, I am on Facebook, but I don't engage with it, or Insta. I don't read a lot of opposition journalism. And there's a method behind this, and that I found when the social media explosion hit, spending a lot of time on Twitter, a lot of time just taking in, and a lot of the Twitter posts I'd read would be links through to stuff stories or things like that, and I found that I was actually subconsciously co-opting ideas. And I hated that because I always had quite prided myself on the fact that I could come up with my own ideas and my own thoughts. And every now and then I start to write something. I think, I feel like I've read this before. And it was actually happening. Like I was saying to co-opt, and that's borderline plagiarism. I don't think I ever went as far as plagiarising, but it started to worry me a bit. So I made a real effort to get out of all that social media. I didn't like Twitter.
It's interesting you say that, because Rats is cut from a similar cloth in the fact that he's not on social media. He's not influenced by Twitter or Facebook, or he hears conversations around the office, but most of the time it's genuinely what he sees is what he thinks. Yeah, and I think that a lot myself too. It's like I spend a lot too much time on Twitter.
Yeah,
I'm always trying to break up with Twitter, and I never win that battle. And I sort of justify it by saying I need it for my job, which I don't. But you're right. You co-opt people's opinions.
Yeah,
you hear some sort of big voices who are often in your stream and what they're thinking of a game, and you're kind of like, well, Do I think that way, or am I just agreeing with what they say? And it can cloud your judgment.
So there's New Zealand journalists and New Zealand sports thinkers who I enjoy. I enjoy talking to them about sport, even if I don't ingest all their work. Scotty Stephenson would be probably number one. I think he's got a razor sharp intellect. He's a fantastic thinker of sport, talented broadcaster, and actually an underrated flat-out journalist. I think probably people, when they think of Scotty Stephenson, think initially of the kind of TV personality, the commentator. I actually think I think he's bloody good at that, but I think he's a better journalist than he is a broadcaster.
He wrote a great column. Was that under your reign too? He did a sort of weekly column.
Yeah.
It was a cracker.
Yeah, he's a fantastic columnist, and he's a very unself-conscious columnist, which we need more of in New Zealand. I think we have far too many writers in New Zealand who worry that if they actually speak what's really on their mind, they might make a dick of themselves, where he doesn't. He just lays it all out there. If he loves someone, he says it. He wrote an amazing column about watching a rugby match with his dying father.
Yeah, it was bloody good.
Whereas I don't think there's many that would have done that. So he's one. Dana Johansson's another. Obviously, I was very close to Dana when she worked at the Herald. She made a terrible move and went to stuff. Which turned out to be a very good move for her, but a terrible move for us. Again, yeah, I probably shouldn't say this in case she ever listens to this, but I probably don't take in all the stuff she does now at stuff, but she is someone I admire because she had a plan to get better as a journalist. She was honest and humble enough to recognise that some of the stuff she was doing wasn't as good as it could be, and she just thought one day, well, I don't know if she thought one day, she just set out to become as good a journalist as she could be, and she's outstanding now, and I she's got goings to prove it. Yeah, I mean, it feels like one of these things where you are being nasty by omission here, because there's plenty of people that I admire, but those two I certainly think...
Well, let's talk about, I just want to piggyback on that. You say she's continuing to improve as a journalist.
Yes.
Are you continuing to improve as a journalist? And I want to sort of go back to the start in a way. I wanted to touch on this earlier. Obviously, graduate school as a journalist has changed a lot in the last 25 years. Do you think that, would you encourage young journos to do that? Or is it better just getting that experience and getting into a newsroom?
I don't think there's any wrong or right way. I think for me, it probably worked because it gave me some foundation. It's hard for me to give advice for how youngsters should get into the game when I only did it one way, and it was a very prescribed way. It was a classic kind of way. You get a degree at a university, get a postgraduate journalism, go into the job market. I know a lot of guys. Chris Barclay's another guy who I think's a fantastically underrated New Zealand sports journalist who spent a lot of time in Australia now, so he's probably not that recognised here. But he was one of the old cadets that left school and go straight into a newsroom, and I think that would have been a fantastic way of doing it as well. I very nearly did it. Went that route. Very nearly went from New Plymouth Boys High into the Taranaki Herald. Was probably fortunate that I didn't, because the Taranaki Herald was an afternoon paper and was shut down about a year later, so that might have killed the journalism dream there and then. But yeah, I wouldn't be arrogant enough to say there's a right way and a wrong way, but if you want to be a sports journalist, just find a way. Or you want to be a journalist at all, just find a way.
And are you still improving as a journalist?
No, I don't think I'm improving as a journalist, but have written a couple of pieces probably in the last year where I've felt, that's probably as well as I've ever written. I don't know if... Again, we're going back, and I don't want to sound like a martyr here or anything like that, but that Longest Goodbye series did something to me, and I'm not quite sure what it was, but I fell out of love with journalism after that. For quite a long time. It took me a long time to get back, and I got into other things like running, and I became a bit of a lazy journalist for a while. But just over the last year, if I can be so arrogant to say, that I think I've written a couple of pieces. I might not have had the story breaks or anything like that, but there's a couple of pieces that I've written that I felt like, I can still do this.
Yeah. I would back that up. I think specifically over the last few months, it seems like you've really found your fire and your will again, and you've been delivering as the premium editor.
Well, I hope that lasts.
All right, you just briefly touched on it there. We get into the home straight, your running journey. So you mentioned sumo, and I understand that you've been doing a few long runs with him as you're prepping for the Old Ghost Road. So talk us through what's involved there.
Okay, the Old Ghost Road is just a wee trot on the west coast of the South Island where you run 85 k's in a day across the Lyell Range. It's a lot. It's a lot more than I've ever done, and I'm mildly terrified about the prospect now.
What's the most you've done at the moment?
The most I've done, I think I've gone out and run about before the days of the Apple Watch. No, not before the days, before I owned an Apple Watch. I think I went out and ran about 40k one day. So
double it.
So I've never done an official marathon, although I trained for the Rotorua Marathon years and years ago, and it got washed out on the day. So I was on the start line when the announcement came over the tannoy, so that was pretty frustrating. But every second week I'll go out and run about a 30 to 35k run. So I've got a long way to go before I can turn that into 85, but I listen to the things I want to hear when it comes to running, and one of the things that I hear is that if you can run 50k, then you've reached a kind of plateau where you can just keep going. So
I had a bad case of gastro flu over the weekend and shat a lot. I've heard when you run long distances that can happen.
Yep.
Has that ever happened to you? Runner's shits, I believe they call it?
No, but I have quite an active, I think it's the peristaltic system or something like that, so I get quite gassy when I run. So you don't often want to be trailing and just downwind of me, but no, there's some footage of like really high profile runners just
horrendous.
Going off and doing that. So
when is the race?
I call it a run. I call it a run, not a race.
Okay.
It's
when is the run?
February. I was hoping to get an entry into the Taupo 50k as a nice prep for it, but I missed out. I was too late for that.
Just say you'll write about it. I'll put you in.
Yeah, good idea. Maybe I'll get the premium editor to write a letter.
Do you think you'd have a chance at the old Kipchoge challenge?
No, I'm 12 for that now. I'm about to turn 50. But my journey to running kind of proficiency is kind of probably started from a similar place as Steve, in that I wasn't, different, but I wasn't happy with my fitness and my weight, and I took a junket to Canada to go skiing actually, and I was getting weighed up for my skis and my gear, and they said, how much do you weigh? And I gave them a figure, which I thought it was, and they said, just jump on these electronic things. And I wasn't, and that was it's
a horrible one.
I
had that at the airport in the Solomon Islands. Everyone else was being weighed onto this Twin Otter plane, and I knew the guy who was a relative of mine that was checking people in, and I went, do I need to be weighed? He said, nah, I put you down as 100 kg. That's right, eh? And I went, Yeah. As long as you take liberties with everyone else, I think that's okay.
Big ballparks.
Planes stay in the air, right? But yeah, it's not a great feeling.
Yeah. So and that kind of when I was at my most overweight was also at the time where I was most sort of disillusioned with journalism. So I found I was sitting at my desk, staring at my screen. 11:30, that's close enough. Go out for a lunchtime walk, and I just started walking. And then I combined that with a stupid diet, which I did for about a month. I didn't continue the diet, but I just continued the walking, and I got to a point where I felt like I could run a bit without my back feeling so sore that it was going to bring everything down. And when I started to get a little bit stronger and able to run up hills without feeling like I was going to collapse at the top of them, I actually rediscovered how much I really enjoyed it.
When you know you've got a 30k run the next day, are you looking forward to it?
Yeah, I am now.
Yeah,
that's madness.
Sounds like hell.
Yeah. So I'm even kind of co-opting people to come for runs with me and twisting their arms. So it's I get a bit obsessive about it actually.
Can I ask a question?
Go on, mate.
We are a predominantly football-based podcast.
Yes, we should really talk about football at some point.
Well, I'm really interested in your opinions of the global game in New Zealand.
Yep.
Would you care to share some of those?
Well,
and then I've got a follow-up question.
I think you're leading me somewhere here, and that is that Steve and I have had these chats about why I felt like football people were the worst people in New Zealand. and because we were doing it within the bonds of friendship, I would give these theories to him, which are quite outrageous and probably would get me in trouble. So I'll temper it a little bit by saying that my son plays football, has done since he was tiny, and my daughter did. She's stopped now, and I can say that over the past couple of years, I have noticed a vast improvement. Okay, but when my kids started playing football, I just could not believe how toxic the sideline was. I was, compared to the other sports they played, I was just blown away. And then I thought about, well, why am I surprised by this? Because the most toxic feedback I've ever had as a sports journalist has also been from football people. So I thought, well, it probably goes hand in hand. And so what I've told Steve, okay, and you can take this for what it's worth because it's just me ripping off the top of my head, is that I just think for generations shit behaviour was tolerated in New Zealand football. And whether that's, and not just New Zealand football, whether that's simulation on the field, language to the referees, language from the sidelines, negative comments from the sidelines, but that shit behaviour was just normalised, okay? And in some ways, given some of the cult figures in New Zealand football history, in some ways even celebrated, okay? And I think, and this is a theory, it's mine, I take ownership of it, but I am also willing to concede I might be totally wrong. I think there's a lot of residual bitterness in the New Zealand football community. It's the biggest global sport by a country mile, but it's not in New Zealand. And I've lost count of how many emails I've received, and you can tell just from the subject line it's going to be painful, but saying, why does rugby get so much coverage? It just spews out a whole lot of numbers about why football's the global game and should be getting far more coverage. And my answer to that is that rugby is the national sport in New Zealand, but you can get into these kind of circular arguments where there's no winners. But and again, theory, not fact. I reckon we've had a touch of cultural cringe in New Zealand when it's come to football, and we've just felt like because rugby's the national sport, we felt like we can't actually run the game here, so we've turned it over to a lot of people from the UK. And he put let's be honest, we're not getting the cream of the crop, are we? We're often getting the ones over here whose career probably hasn't worked out for them as they planned in the UK. That's why they're here. So they're bringing a touch of attitude with them in their suitcases. They're they're probably, but not always, maybe technically limited, but hard as nails, and want to imbue that kind of personality and attitude in New Zealand. And look, I know I'm getting into dangerously thin sociological arguments here, but I think that might be some of the reason. I think that we get this, we had this really toxic sideline culture in New Zealand. But look, I love football as a sport. It cracked the code, didn't it? It was simple rules that anyone could understand, played on a field with dimensions anyone could understand. There's
it's an interesting take.
Cheap as chips to play.
Me and Dylan have had discussions about that, and he sort of said, do you align with these views? Because it would be great to get a sort of first-person perspective on it. And I sort of said, well, I don't really know I don't know what it's like in a cricket culture or a rugby culture. I agree with certain things, what he's saying, abuse of refs and sideline behaviour. It seems to be inherited that is just the way you do it in football. It's like rugby's a gentleman's game. You never say anything to the ref. You never get in their face.
No,
football, cricket, any other sport really, other than football, because we're seeing it at Champions League level, English Premier League, the games that we're watching our heroes play. That's how they act. So it's kind of like, well, that's how you act. And I've seen coaches on the sideline for teams I've played with terrible behaviour, which has been mimicked by younger players coming through, and it sort of just encourages that cycle. So there are parts of what he's saying I agree with, but I don't have enough experience in other codes to suggest that it is exclusive to football.
Yeah, and I really want to emphasise actually, because it's important, that over the past couple of years I have seen I've heard and seen a shift. I honestly think that's the case. And I actually think you are overseas too. I mean, I'm not talking about Latin America here, where I've got no experience. I've seen no games really, or even continental Europe. But I just think there's a lot more respect even in the Premier League now than we used to see. Some of the stuff that Marcus Rashford and Jordan Henderson, people like that are doing. It just feels like the sport's going into a better place now, and I hope it permeates every level. I hope it permeates through to a lot of the learned behaviours that you talk about, like the way that you address referees, and maybe VAR, for all its faults, will take some of that nastier abuse of referees out of the game, because there's I know it's not perfect yet, but there is now another arbiter of the game, sitting on high.
Yeah. Shay?
From a media perspective, what do you think football could do more of to get more column inches or exposure if people are complaining about it?
Yeah.
What do you think the sport could do itself?
Bloody difficult. And it's really difficult in this current era in particular, because it's a common argument from sports that aren't rugby, and to a lesser extent cricket probably, is that basketball's another one that's very hot on that at the moment. We should be getting more coverage. Second biggest sport in the world. The Breakers are a powerhouse. I wonder if, because streaming and overseas cable sports channels are so prevalent in New Zealand households now. I mean, we can flick on our TV and watch NBA. I wonder if there's a kind of almost a turn your nose up at the Australian NBL, so we don't really cover the Breakers, because no one cares about the Breakers when we can watch LeBron playing for the Lakers. I wonder if there's a sort of similar thing with New Zealand football there, that the Phoenix, we'll get in behind them if they're doing well, but if they're not, well then, to be honest, I'd rather watch Man City versus...
Well, that is the crux of the issue in New Zealand, isn't it? When you're watching rugby, you are watching the best players in the world live. If you're going to a game, you're seeing in person the best. Yeah. When you're watching a live football game in New Zealand, even if it's the Phoenix, that's like 8th tier, right? So you're not seeing the best in the world. Yeah. And that's what it comes down to.
And back in the day, it was very difficult to watch that overseas stuff. You know, you would watch the big league soccer or match of the day on a Sunday lunchtime, and that was your exposure to overseas football. So you're more likely to go to a game. Reporters would all go to the games, and the National League was big for a while. Like, probably betraying my age here, but I remember when Mount Wellington were a thing, and Mataraway were a thing, and there was like Chatham Cup final was pretty big. The All Whites would have decent opposition here quite regularly. Maybe that wasn't exactly the case, but I probably had rose-tinted glasses on there. But it just felt like soccer meant something a bit more. And, I used to go and watch the National Basketball League as well, where the Saints would play New Plymouth or the Canterbury Rams and that, and each team would have 2 American imports, and it felt pretty neat. But then all of a sudden you got ESPN.
It is hard to compare, isn't it?
You're watching the Celtics and the Lakers, and then suddenly you go to the YMCA and thinking, actually, no, this is not that.
Yeah.
And that's not fair on the players, but that's...
Well, get yourself down and watch some Northern Premier League, because it is the toughest competition in 20 years, because all the sort of journeyman players from America and around the world are back home, and so it's a good level. Get down Forest Hill, your local club.
I've heard Claudeland's are the team to follow, isn't it?
Claudeland's. Well, hey, listen, Dylan, that has nearly been 2.5 hours, believe it or not.
You'll need some very incisive editing.
No, that's been amazing. I think that's been full of things, context and subject matters that people will find very interesting. Shay actually disclosed in a little bathroom break that it's inspired in him a desire to do more writing. So you might have a passion there with a young man with a big future. Shay, thoughts on the episode?
Yeah, like you've just disclosed, it's kind of reinvigorated telling stories. I think is quite a cool thing, and really nice to go down memory lane about kind of Sunday newspapers and bits of my not so distant past.
The Sunday newspaper competition was quite a cool little part of New Zealand history. Small, but I was glad to be part of it, and thank you very much for allowing me to ramble on for so long in the comfort of my own home.
Loved it. Cheers, Dylan.